Good evening, everyone. We're going to just give people a minute or two just to join us, but we'll be starting very soon. Okay, everyone, we're going to get started just because I can see that a lot of people have already joined us tonight. There might be a couple more who will be joining as we go. Hi, hello, and welcome to our event, What Does It Mean to Belong? An online panel discussion with local Jewish community members. I'm Emma, I'm the Learning and Engagement Officer at St Albans Museums, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event that marks the official opening of the online exhibition, Arriving and Belonging, Stories for the St Albans Jewish Community. Just before we get started, I just wanted to draw your attention to some housekeeping. If you have any technical questions, any issues with hearing anything or things like that, please do put it in the chat and that'll come directly to me and I will try and address any issues that you might have. You will have an opportunity later on in the event to ask questions of the panel members. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to write down any questions that you have for the panel. And we will arrange for them to be able to answer those at the end of the session. We're very honoured to be joined by Her Majesty's Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire, Mr. Robert Voss, CBE, CStJ, who will be giving a short introduction to the event. I'm going to ask him to turn his camera on and I will pass over to him for a moment. Thank you so much, Lord Lieutenant.
Thank you very much, and a very great honour to be with you this evening and very much looking forward to hearing the stories. Throughout history, Jews have been on the move, from Moses leading his people out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, being expelled from England by Edward I in 1290 and only allowed to return in the interregnum years 370 years later, being expelled from Spain or forced to convert to Catholicism by the Inquisition in the early 15th century, and many had to flee the pogroms of the 19th and 20th centuries. Of course, the largest persecution of Jews took place in World War II, and many arrived in England as refugees, including my parents, who were both born as Jews in Germany and just managed to escape the Nazis, my father only in mid-1939. My grandparents and over 60 members of my father's family were murdered in the gas chambers, and I only found out the final fate of my grandparents 4 years ago, thanks to the BBC, who took me on a journey in a program called British Jews, German Passports, on a journey of discovery to Germany. And at that time, I found and got this yellow star worn by my uncle, the same named Robert Voss, together with his false documentation, which managed to keep him alive. My parents only found out what it meant to belong when they came to England as refugees at the outset of the war. For as Jews, they were never allowed to belong to German society after Hitler came to power in 1933. And I'm extremely proud that Hertfordshire has a long-standing and excellent relationship with its large Jewish community. How wonderful to hear the stories of Jewish families who've made their homes in this great historic city of St Albans, the home of the first British Christian martyr, and the wonderful cathedral which I enjoy so much, and find a certain irony being a Jew with my own padded seat in the Abbey in the front row, the oldest site of continuous worship in Britain. It clearly demonstrates the excellent relationship between Britain, and certainly St Albans, and the Jewish people. And I know that thanks to this country taking in my refugee parents 80 years ago, I truly know what it means to belong, something that Her Majesty agrees with by appointing me, a Jew, as her personal representative in this great county. So it gives me enormous pleasure to officially open this evening's events, and I very much look forward to hearing the stories that follow.
Thank you so much, Lord Lieutenant. We're now very pleased to be able to hear from local MP Daisy Cooper.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to join you this evening. I'm really struck by the title of this exhibition, Arriving and Belonging, because they're very emotive words, and we've probably all got lots of recollections of times in our lives when we've arrived somewhere and moments where we had, maybe for the first time, a sense of belonging. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful title. One of the things that I'm struck by in St Albans are the number of people on the one hand who are born and bred in St Albans, and they're very, very proud of that fact. But equally, people who have moved to St Albans or who've arrived in St Albans are equally just as proud. This is their adopted city and their adopted area, and they take so much pride when bringing friends and family to our city to actually show them what their area is like and all the different places. You know, the Abbey and the park and the High Street and all these little bits of history here, there and everywhere. Everyone's so proud of it. Some of you, if you were living in St Albans, will have received my annual report recently through the door. We sent it out to every single household in St Albans. And on the inside front cover, there's a collage of photographs, and it's about celebrating our community. And I made sure that this was incredibly prominent in my annual report, because I want to take a stand as the Member of Parliament for St Albans to say that I think it is a fabulous, wonderful thing that we have such a diverse community here. And it includes photographs of me speaking at the Black Lives Matter protest last summer, supporting the St Albans for Refugees group that organises a reverse Santa every Christmas time, supporting the Stockwell Community Trust, who ran a lantern competition for children around the time of Ramadan. Also includes a photograph of when I supported you and joined you for your Hanukkah celebration, and lots of other LGBT events and International Women's Day. We are a diverse city, and I think we should all be incredibly proud of that. And at a time when our country and our communities can feel very divided, I think it is incredibly important that those of us who are in public life take a stand to say that we believe that diversity is a good thing, and we will continue to make sure that our communities are inclusive for all. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some of the stories that follow. And I just think it's a wonderful idea to look at these ideas of arriving and belonging. So thanks very much again.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Lovely to hear from you. I'm now going to be passing on to Helen Singer, who's been spearheading this project and will be chairing the event. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you. So thank you so much to the Lord Lieutenant of Hertfordshire and to Daisy Cooper for that lovely introduction. And we're also so pleased to be joined by such a large audience. So yeah, welcome to this online panel discussion about what it means to belong. As you know, it's linked to the exhibition Arriving and Belonging, Stories from the St Albans Jewish Community. This is actually based on some projects where we collected stories from members of St Albans Majesty Synagogue, or SAMS, two projects called SAMS Roots and Mapping SAMS Roots. So as Emma said, yes, I'm Helen. I'm one of the project team, along with Caroline Pierce and Pauline Simons. And I'm delighted to welcome our panel members, so Sylvia Schloss, Darren Marks, and Debbie Hoodie. So just a little bit about the panel. Sylvia's lived in the local area for 27 years and has worked as an editor and a journalist. Darren has lived locally for 15 years. He's currently chair of SAMS and he works as a hypnotherapist. Debbie's lived in the area since 1996 and is a geography lecturer at the University of Hertfordshire. And I've lived in St Albans since 1985, and I also worked at the university as a librarian from 1996 until last year when I retired. So just going to say a few words about the exhibition. It was scheduled to open in the Keepers Galleries of the St Albans Museum and Gallery. So we've worked closely with Sarah Keeling, the curator, but due to COVID and lockdown, the in-person exhibition has been postponed, and it won't now open until the 4th of February until the 15th of May next year. But in the meantime, at the end of this panel event, we're going to launch the online exhibition. And in the exhibition, you'll virtually meet members of the St Albans Jewish community with roots from around the world, and they'll be telling their stories through personal objects and family photographs. So we're really pleased to have 3 of the contributors here to share their stories. and talk about the impact of their stories on their lives. So their stories and those of the other contributors reflect the universal themes of sanctuary, courage, compassion, setting down roots, work and community. And they also reflect key moments in Jewish history. So the Lord Lieutenant already spoke about the history of Jewish people in St Albans in England. So there is a timeline which shows that yes, it reaches from back to Aaron of Lincoln. Somebody just put a question in the chat actually. So apparently a moneylender called Aaron of Lincoln, as money lending was one of the few things that Jewish people could do, lent money for the building of the Abbey in St Albans. And then as has been said, all Jews were expelled in 1290 by Edward I, and then were allowed back in at the time of Cromwell 350 years later. One of our contributors can trace her ancestors right back to one of the earliest settlers from this time. And you'll also see a world map in the exhibition showing the geographical origins and the story, so the location of some of these stories. So you can see that they really are from around the world. And we've also got a map showing the location of Jewish businesses in St Albans from about the 1930s to the 1980s. And that's using information from one of our contributors, Jennifer Taylor, who was born and brought up in St Albans and still lives here today. And you can see some of the items in the display and in the exhibition that she's contributed. Her parents actually had a clothes shop called Adair's, where the Peahen is now. And then going forward in history, at a more local level, there were Jewish families working at the Nicholson's Raincoat Factory in Sutton Road in Fleetville, those of you who know St Albans. And we know from census records that many of those people would have come from Russia fleeing persecution at the turn of the last century. And one of our contributors, Jo Conroy, her grandfather worked at Nicholson's and her grandmother had a fur trimming shop right next to Nicholson's. The timeline also goes on to show the founding of the St Albans United Synagogue and then later Sam's. So our panelist stories and those of the other contributors really show how the Jewish experience has been affected by some of the historical events we just talked about. My story is just one of many, but similar to the Lord Lieutenant, my parents were child refugees from Germany, both of them. My mother came on the kinder transport and her life was, and those of her brother and sister, and my grandmother was saved by an English friend of my grandmother's called Mary Caro. And in the exhibition, you'll see a photograph of my mother arriving at Liverpool Street Station in July 1939. And then my father was sent to England to school. His parents were both dentists in Nuremberg in Germany, but at Kristallnacht, my grandfather was sent to Dachau. But the wonderful headmaster of Farnham Grammar School, Dr. Morgan, arranged for my grandparents to come to England, so their lives were saved too. So it highlights huge acts of kindness, but also sadness as my grandfather perished in Auschwitz. But we are so grateful that my family found sanctuary here. So I'm going to talk to the panelists now. So in the courage theme, I'd like to turn to Debbie Huggie. Debbie, can you tell us a little bit about your great-grandfather, Józef Tybiański, and how he came to England?
Hi there. I just should start by saying that, just so I don't confuse you, my family name is actually Perlman. And there's a bit of a story about how we got the name. So my great-grandfather, Józef or Joseph, left the town of Kretinga, which is now in Lithuania, but then it was in Russia, in 1874. And he was fleeing from anti-Jewish pogroms that were happening in Russia at the time. And there was also this threat of being enlisted into the Russian army as well. Someone else in the village had gone to the northeast of England. So that's where Joseph headed to on a ship. And the family story goes that when he arrived in South Shields, as he got off the boat, the custom officers said, "So, pet, what's your name?" And my great-grandfather said, "My name is Józef Tybiański." And the customs officer said, "Well, I'm sorry, pet, I can't spell that. The guy in front was called Perlman, so that's your name now." So we know that's not exactly how it happened because immigrants actually had to go and register later on, but it's apparently how we got the Perlman family name. Joseph actually later became a successful coal merchant and was part of setting up the synagogue in South Shields with others from Kretinga. and you'll be able to see his prayer book in the exhibition when it runs. My grandfather Sam, who fought in the First World War, moved from Fellshields to Redcar, where my father was born, and my father moved to Leeds to study law, which is where I was born.
Thank you, Debbie. So also in the courage theme of the exhibition, we've got the amazing story from Sylvia Schloss, whose mother Eva was in hiding in Amsterdam with her parents and brother Heinz in the Second World War. Sylvia, can you tell us a bit about the events Eva relates in her book, The Promise, and your uncle Heinz's paintings, one of which we can see reproduced in the exhibition?
Yes, hello. Well, my mother and her mother were in one hiding place in Amsterdam, while her brother Heinz and her father were in a completely different place. Families were often separated like this when they went into hiding for practical reasons and to reduce the risk of being discovered. So my mother had no idea that Heinz had hidden all the paintings that he and her father had done during their months in hiding. So, and the whole family was betrayed in 1944 and put on a transport. And it was on the train to Auschwitz concentration camp that Heinz told my mother he had hidden the paintings under the attic floor of their hideaway. So after my mother and grandmother had survived the horrors of Auschwitz, they returned to Amsterdam and sure enough, found the paintings exactly where Heinz had hidden them after everything that had happened, with a note which said, property of Erich and Heinz Geiringer from Amsterdam, who were in hiding and will collect the items after the war. Erich and Heinz never returned. So for my mother and grandmother, these paintings were a precious link to their loved ones, who they were never to see again. But more generally, I think they're also a moving reminder of the importance of preserving and displaying art and artifacts, which is at the heart of a museum's work.
Thank you so much. I wondered if you also wanted to mention how Anne Frank's father Otto came to be your step-grandfather.
Yeah, well, when my mother's family came over as immigrants from Vienna to Amsterdam, they lived in an area where a number of other Jewish families had settled. And one of these families was the Frank family from Germany. So my mother got to know Anne and the rest of the Frank family quite well and was particularly happy to be able to speak German with them, as she was finding it rather difficult to learn Dutch. But after the war, Otto Frank, who had lost his whole family, returned to Amsterdam, where he eventually got to know my mother and grandmother again. And in the end, the survivors of the two families formed their own family when my grandmother Fritzi, in the picture you can see, married Otto Frank. That's the picture of their wedding.
Lovely, thank you. Yes. So in the community section, we've got the story of Darren Marks, whose ancestors are Sephardi, which means they're of Spanish and Portuguese origin, and they will have left during the Spanish Inquisition. Darren, can you tell us a little bit about Bevis Marks Synagogue and the work you did there?
Yes, so Bevis Marks Synagogue is the oldest synagogue to be in continuous use both in the UK and Europe. It was built in 1701 by Jews who had fled the Spanish Inquisition and then had made their home in Amsterdam, and they'd been allowed to return to England by Oliver Cromwell. It was the first Jewish community in the UK, as the Lord Lieutenant mentioned earlier, since Edward I expelled all of the Jews in 1290. One of my ancestors, Abraham Vaz Martinez, was one of the first wardens of the synagogue, and the building itself was built by the Quaker John Avis, who it said returned the profit he made to the congregation because he didn't want to benefit financially from the building of a house of God. And it's also believed that Queen Anne presented an oak beam from one of the Royal Navy's ships to be incorporated into the roof of the building. So there's a lot of symbolism built into the structure. For example, there are 7 many-branched candelabra, and you can see some of them in the picture here, hanging from the ceiling, and they represent the days of the week. And the largest one in the center represents the Sabbath. And there are 12 pillars, which you can't see in this photograph, which surround the balcony, and they represent, or which prop up the balcony, and they represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So as a student of furniture restoration in the 1990s, I worked on restoring the benches and other furniture and wooden objects in the building. And there was something incredibly special about working on pieces hundreds of years old that I know would have been used by my ancestors when they first came to this country.
It's a lovely sense of continuity there, isn't there? Can you also tell us the story of your mother's grandfather and how he came to leave Russia?
Yeah, so my mother's family are Ashkenazi as opposed to Sephardi, and they were born in, my great-grandfather's family was born in Lodz in Poland, which in the early 1900s was under Russian rule. The law at that time was that any boy after the eldest was conscripted into the Russian army. And at the age of 21, my great-grandfather Harry was already engaged to my great-grandmother Sally, and he was sent to an army camp in the Ukraine. And he wrote to his brother Jacob saying how unhappy he was that he didn't think he could stay there for another 3 years. His brother organized documents and papers to help him to escape to the UK. And then he arranged that when Harry was on guard duty at an outlying post, he would meet him there. And he arrived with civilian clothes, documents and money. Harry put his rifle into the ground and draped his army greatcoat over it and put the cap on top so it looked like a person was still standing there. So after making his way to England, arrangements were then made for Sally to join him. We as a family are very lucky that Harry and Sally made it here in 1913, as almost all of their extended family were later murdered by the Nazis during the Holocaust.
So thank you so much for sharing these powerful stories, and you'll be able to learn about more stories illustrating these and the other themes when you visit the exhibition. So I wanted to talk a little about the effect of these stories on your lives. Do you think they've made a difference? For example, my mother and father arrived in England as children, as I've said, and they very quickly assimilated. They didn't speak German to each other or with us. So my sister and I had to learn German from scratch at school. And we found something my mother had written after she died. And she said that as a young girl here, she wanted to be as English as anything and marry an Englishman, have children called, I think it's John and Elizabeth. But she was so pleased to have found refuge here. So there is a sense of legacy and feeling it's important that their stories aren't forgotten, particularly as there is still racism, sadly genocide, which hasn't stopped with the Holocaust. So going back to you, Debbie, can you tell us a bit about your love of geography, your career and your visit to Kretinga, where your ancestors were from?
Well, yes, thank you, Helen. I've been a lecturer in geography at the University of Hertfordshire for nearly 30 years. And before that, I was a town planner. So not unsurprisingly, I've always loved maps and landscapes and old buildings. When I was a little girl, I used to look at this page in the big Times Atlas that we had at my parents' house. And it was the page with this bit of Russia on it, the USSR, that included, written very faintly, Kretinga. And I used to imagine this village and that landscape and what my family life had been like there. I suppose it was a bit influenced a little bit by Fiddler on the Roof. But actually, when we went back for my father's 80th birthday a few years ago, we did actually visit Kretinga in Lithuania. Some of the villages still did resemble the villages of Fiddler on the Roof. And it was really incredible to actually be in that map, in that town, in that landscape. It was really quite a remarkable visit. Through our genealogical work, we had established that Tybiansky or Tubiansky was actually correct. It wasn't a made-up story. It was actually written on a relative's nationalization paper. And we've also had help from a Lithuanian genealogist. And we've got hold of the town census with the Tybiansky name and the relatives going back a few more generations as well. Yeah. So when we were in Kretinga, we visited the Jewish cemetery, which we didn't know its extent. It was actually huge. And unbelievably, amongst the remaining gravestones, we actually found one with the name Tibiansky on it. You can actually see us there in the picture in Kretinga, not at the cemetery. We had no idea, but we also found when we were there a mass Holocaust grave as well. But my relatives were very lucky to escape so early on, so we didn't lose anybody in the Holocaust. We said Kaddish, the memorial prayer, at the gates of the cemetery, and it really was a very poignant family moment.
I can imagine, thank you. So what about you, Darren? Can you tell us a bit about your mother being born in St Albans and the community project you did at SAMS in her memory?
So yes, my grandmother Sylvia, Harry and Sally's youngest daughter, married my grandfather Alf on the 10th of August 1940 at Hendon Synagogue, just after Alf had been drafted into the army at the beginning of World War II. Sylvia was evacuated to Diocesan House in St Albans to give birth to my mother Sandra in 1942. Diocesan House was originally a coaching inn known as the Verulam Arms, which opened in 1826. It became the official residence of the Anglican Bishop of St Albans in 1908, and by 1926 it had become a Church of England retreat and conference centre. During the war, it became a maternity hospital for women evacuated from London, and more than 2,000 babies were born there during the war years. Today, it is Verulam House nursing and residential home, and for the last few years, once a year, the young children of our community visit to sing, play with and entertain the residents. And it always makes me smile when I see photos of the visit on our social media feeds, and you can see one of them, here and on your screen. And it makes me remember the history of the place as well as my own family connections, and I love this kind of sense of continuity today as well. So sadly, my mum died 20 years ago, just before my two sons were born. But one of the projects we worked on at SAMS, both as a family and a community project, was the cutting out in wood and the fixing of the Hebrew phrase above the ark in our synagogue. The words are Hinei Matov Umanayim, and they come from the Bible and mean how good it is for people to dwell together in unity. And you can see a photo here of me and my two boys. Adam on the left there is 20 today, actually.
Oh.
So it was a few years ago we made that. He's grown up a little bit since then, and then it's his younger brother Benjamin and my dad. Sorry, when I made these words with my son's wife and father, sorry, I'm getting a little bit emotional because my dad is actually in hospital today.
No, I'm sorry.
He's very unwell, so it's really nice to see him in this picture. Members of our community, when we made it, we discussed with the community, my mum, and being sorry.
Oh, shall I finish this bit?
No, sorry, let me finish, please. So we discussed her being with her, her being born in St Albans, and I still think of her and our story and our connection to the city and to our synagogue when I look up at those words in our building.
That's so special. Thank you. Oh, thanks for sharing that with us. Yeah, and we wish your father speedy recovery.
Thank you.
So I'll go. So moving on to Sylvia then. So Sylvia, I know you've been keen to help when we've co-hosted events at SAMS with Hearts Welcomes Refugees, which the Lord Lieutenant is a patron of. And do you think having a refugee background yourself has motivated you? I know it's influenced me in my voluntary work with refugees.
Yes, it definitely has influenced me. I remember when I was a student at Leeds University a few years ago now, it was at the time that the Vietnamese refugees were coming to the UK. And a few of us students decided to get together and offered to visit some Vietnamese families in Leeds to try and help them settle in and teach them English. So that was one example I think a lot of intolerance and prejudice stems from a lack of knowledge about other people's culture and background. So education is really important in this. And when my children were still at school, I used to go in and talk to the school students about some of our Jewish festivals and holidays. I also organised an international day where we had food, music and dance from the various countries and cultural backgrounds of the children at the school. It was a great way to celebrate diversity on a local community level. So.
I wondered if we could think about our attitude to refugees and migrants, and whether our backgrounds have influenced us. I know I do feel really sorry for unaccompanied child refugees who are prevented from family reunion with relatives in this country. And that definitely stems from the fact that my parents were child refugees and found sanctuary here. What do you think, Debbie?
So, as I've said, my great-grandfather, indeed all of my great-grandparents were migrants from Russia or Poland, seeking a better life away from violence. Their lives weren't easy when they arrived because anti-Semitism was here too and life was hard economically. But they grew into their British lives. I always imagined them trying to lose their Russian accents and dressing like the Englishers. They worked hard at integrating and assimilating by not speaking Yiddish. And as I said, my great-grandfather Joseph Perlman became a successful coal merchant and a minor philanthropist as well. The family had to find a balance between integrating and still being Jewish, by being members of the synagogue, but also by being active members in the wider community. My parents were brought up to be fully involved and understand that being what it meant to be the grandchild of an immigrant, and all those issues that go with fitting in and establishing a life in Britain. And that notion definitely passed on to me as well. Funnily enough, when I was a teenager in Leeds, I also worked with the Vietnamese people that came to Leeds. I'm a bit younger than you, Sil, obviously. And my dad he also looked after the legal affairs of the newly arrived Sikh community in Leeds as well. And as a great grandchild of migrants, I'm really grateful for their hardship and endeavour, but also to the tolerance of the British people. And I've undertaken, especially through my work and teaching at the University of Hertfordshire, to welcome and work with migrants and refugees as generations did before me.
Darren, do you think your attitudes to migration have been affected by your family stories?
Yes, there's no doubt about that. My great-grandfather Harry made his way across the English Channel by boat illegally from Calais with the help of French friends, and for many years he lived in fear of being found out until 1939, when he turned himself in at a police station at the beginning of the war because all foreign nationals needed an ID card to get rations and so on. There were no issues. He'd been in the country a long time, and to his great relief, they just gave him a card. I'm very grateful that he and my great-grandmother were given refuge here, and in so doing managed to avoid the devastation of the Holocaust that followed. On my father's side, the fact that Oliver Cromwell had admitted my ancestors back into the country after the expulsion of 1290 is also something I'm grateful for. Bevis Marks is not the oldest synagogue in the UK or in Europe, but it is the oldest one that's remained in continuous use because the UK has been a safe haven for Jews for over 300 years. And I'm very proud to live in a country that welcomes and protects peoples and cultures from all over the world.
Thank you. So one sort of last question. What does belonging mean to you? So my husband John and I moved here in 1985 when we got married, and John was teaching in Harpenden. And I love St Albans. I like the connection with that it was a sanctuary to the first Christian martyr, St Alban, who sheltered a Christian priest. So I'm proud it's home to so many diverse groups of people. And I think hopefully the purpose of this exhibition, apart from showing our sort of ethnic groups sort of stories, is that the universal themes are actually stories that a lot of different groups of people will have experienced. And as Sylvia said, I think there's something about the more that you know about people, the more you understand. And also hopefully the fact that the individuals are telling their stories, it's very different to just facts and figures on a timeline. So like Debbie, I also, as I said, I worked at the University of Hertfordshire, and I really like meeting students from around the world. One way of belonging we were thinking about is involving ourselves in the local community. And an example of that might be the community or mitzvah day that both local synagogues sort of carry out every year. So for example, there's been projects like tidying the Fleetwood Cemetery, hedgerow planting in Verulamium Park, clearing the River Ver. So you can see there, as we said, family teas with the Syrian refugee families, cooking for Centre 33. And there's some other nice pictures of this type of work in the exhibition. What do you think, Debbie?
Well, Helen, as you said, I actually moved to St Albans in 1996. And when I got married, I moved to Radlett, but stayed with St Albans Majesty Synagogue. And the Sam's community and its people are really very special indeed. And we're an egalitarian community, and those values are really important to me. By the way, my husband, where I'm very proud to have his name, Hugi, his family are actually from Iraq, and he's contributed to the exhibition and tells a very interesting story about the Jews being thrown out of Arab lands in the 1950s that most people know nothing about. But coming back to Sam's, actually, those first two words actually mean a lot to me too. I have a deep affection for this ancient city, St Albans, and I make an annual pilgrimage to the Abbey to see the Hebrew writing on the wall in the South Presbytery aisle. In fact, that was my first date with my husband. I dragged him to see the Hebrew writing on the wall. Yes, it's very exciting for me. Yeah, St Albans is definitely a big part of my identity because I really feel like I belong here, and I really do feel comfortable here.
What about you, Sylvia?
Well, I've always thought of myself as more of a city person, but now, especially in recent years, and of course, particularly this past year, I've come to appreciate how lucky we are to live in an area with such beautiful countryside on our doorstep. And we have a dog, so we really make the most of that. For example, walking in Hartwood Forest is great, and it was really nice that we, as a family, could do our bit planting trees there with Sam's on mitzvah days. Actually, I remember coming to St Albans on a school trip as a child and getting on the coach and thinking, what a long, long way away it was. In fact, I grew up in Edgware and lived just off the Edgware Road, which, as many of you know, is the continuation of the old Roman London Road, which of course goes all the way to St Albans. So it's a very straight route, and I suppose you could say I'm literally living up the road now. So yeah, so that's strange. Yeah.
What about you, Darren?
So this last year has been a very challenging year for everybody. One of the most difficult things as a community has been our inability to gather together for festivals and life cycle celebrations. On Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, a big proportion of the community gathers together in the synagogue to listen to the shofar, a ram's horn, and one of the world's most ancient instruments being blown. Among other things, for us, it announces the new year. This year, it wasn't safe to gather in the synagogue. However, St Albans Cathedral came to our assistance and allowed our shofar blowers to blast the notes under the rabbi's guidance from the top of the cathedral bell tower. I think the picture here is from a rehearsal. The community were able to gather in the field below the tower in socially distant small groups, and it was a really surreal and beautiful experience. Not only did it bring our community together physically for the first and the only time since the pandemic began, it was a wonderful moment of interfaith cooperation really highlighting how much we've been accepted and welcomed by the wider community. It gave us all a real feeling of belonging to our local community, whilst at the same time a real sense of pride in our Jewish culture and heritage.
Yes, it's really sort of came full circle again with the Abbey, didn't it?
Yeah.
Well, thanks for answering all those questions. Now we're absolutely delighted to be able to launch our online exhibition in advance of the in-person exhibition. So rather than making everybody wait for another whole year, we can sort of announce that you can visit arrivingbelonging.com or check the museum's website. So we'd like to thank the panel so much and everyone else who's contributed to the exhibition. We were really fortunate to have some funding in the form of a legacy, so we could work with professional exhibition designers. So we worked with the wonderful Devorah Moritz, who's a heritage professional, and Simon Leach Designs to work on the exhibition. So we just found out how much we didn't know about arranging an exhibition. And it was very challenging because one of the previous projects, Mapping Sam's Roots, we'd collected over 100 stories. We just got the 112th one the other day. And so to distill those down, we know everyone has a story, it's really important, but we had to just focus on a few that you can see the pictures here, which would illustrate the themes that we've talked about. And then working in the sort of 3D space with the designers, our contributors were really patient because we had to keep asking them to measure things and remeasure them. So it's been a massive learning curve and a huge project, which we've been working on it for over a year. So we would like to sort of thank everybody, especially the museum and also the United Synagogue, who've been really helpful in contributing to the exhibition. There is an acknowledgement section of the website to thank everybody involved. So as I just said, everyone does have a story, and we could only include a few in the exhibition and even fewer tonight. But we do think it's really important to share our stories to help us understand each other better. We've put together a toolkit. If you would like help mapping your community's roots, do contact us at arrivingbelonging@esams.org, and we'll be happy to work with communities who would like to put their stories together. So I think there might still be time for some questions. So as Emma said, I think you can type them into the Q&A section and Emma will read them out.
Wonderful, thank you, Helen, and everyone in the panel. So we've already had a few questions. So we had a question a little while back from Marla, who asked about a picture, which I think was a picture that Debbie had on the screen a while back. Let me just get to it 1 second. Oh, no, maybe it was, I think it was Debbie. It was this picture. Whose picture was this? Can someone remember?
That's my family. That is the Perlman family. The gentleman with the beard sitting in the middle, one to the right, my right, that is Joseph Perlman, formerly Josef Tybianski, and sitting on his knee, that is my grandfather Sam Perlman. And in fact, when I very first saw that photo, my son Jacob was about 3. And they were the splitting image of each other, and I got quite a shock actually when I first saw that photo. What's my son doing sitting there? But so yes, and you can see perhaps where I got my curly hair from if you look at the women in the background. A very strong gene there, I think.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Debbie. More a comment than a question here from Andy. The book Eva's Story by Eva Schloss is remarkable, and there are lots of pictures in it, including marriage pictures. I assume that's a question for Sylvia. Would you like to talk a little bit about the book?
Well, I have it right here in case. Well, it is widely available, so a lot of you may well have come across it. You can get it in the libraries, well, it just tells my mother's story. You know, having been in hiding in, as we said, Amsterdam, and how they were betrayed and sent off to Auschwitz. And, you know, and basically it's a story of her survival and her mother, how they helped each other through the most sort of nightmarish events you could imagine. But unfortunately, the rest of her family, her brother and her father, didn't. didn't survive, and it just charts that whole story, and it's extremely powerful, and it's a very important document of that period, of that very, very dark part of our history.
Thank you.
But can I just say, so both Eva and Kitty Hart-Moxon, who's also a contributor to the exhibition and a member of SAMS, have just devoted their lives in recent years telling their stories, and I really admire them for reliving that, really, but also just to help people understand and stop people who say it didn't happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, it also does tell the connection, about the connection with Anne Frank and Otto Frank, of course. So there's that element as well. Yeah.
Lots of really interesting questions here. Someone just wanted to mention that they were so touched by how Darren shared his story and the wonderful picture of his son. Just wanted to mention that. I think it's very, very everyone. Sandy has asked, are you looking at the crossover cultural experience of the St Albans Jewish community and other immigrant peoples? For example, I think of the Dunham's butcher in Almacut, where I live. Chickens were kept in the courtyard, and Muslims went to get them slaughtered in halal way, and Jewish people went for kosher chickens, perhaps. Different days, need for appropriately slaughtered meats. I don't know anything about this history.
No, I don't. But it sounds really interesting.
Sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Does anyone feel it? Have you? I guess the question is about if this exploration has given you a taste to explore other histories.
Well, I think it'd be really interesting to share other stories too. Yes, yeah.
I think so. Evelyn here, I assume what she's asking is, does anyone know the meaning of the Hebrew letters at the cathedral? Yes, Debbie, you might know that.
Yes. I think the word, it actually just means God in Hebrew. So yes, in fact, it was, I think the guesses are on this this call, but I think it was Stephen and Jackie that first introduced me to the Hebrew writing. So yes, it is. You've got to look up.
Great. Okay, I'm definitely going to keep an eye out for that as well. Really interesting question here from Joyce. Speaking about belonging, how do you keep those who are outsiders and feel like outsiders in your community to feel like they belong? How do you help them feel safe in sharing in this space and feel acceptance?
I think SAMS is particularly good at that, actually. There are a lot of families with with family who are maybe in mixed faith relationships and who have lots of family and friends who are not Jewish, who are always made to feel welcome and somehow connected. And you go to a bar mitzvah, like a life cycle ceremony at SAMS, and there's people from everywhere, and they always comment on how welcome they feel, on how what a wonderful time they've had. So I think that's kind of why I ended up being a member myself. I think it's why all of us become members, is because we're made to feel connected and welcomed, even if we haven't necessarily grown up in that background. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, non-judgmental, and
yeah, exactly.
I think they're fairly relaxed.
That's wonderful to hear that the community is such a safe haven for so many people. So Michael has asked, my maternal grandfather arrived in the UK from Poland in 1900, but was interned in the Isle of Man in 1940. Any similar experiences in the exhibition?
I'm really sorry, I missed that because
sure.
Coming up.
Sorry. My maternal grandfather arrived in the UK from Poland in 1900, but he was interned on the Isle of Man in 1940. Any similar experiences in the exhibition?
My grandfather was interned in the Isle of Man, and my father-in-law, but that hasn't made it into the exhibition. But I think it was quite a common experience.
Yeah, yes. My great uncle was also interned in the Isle of Man.
Right, really, yes.
Yeah, I'd recommend to anyone who who's interested in this topic. There's some interesting things about this at the Jewish Museum. and particularly about some unusual, some of the internment camps. There was a lot of interesting artistic development in some of these camps as well at the time as well. So it's really fascinating topic.
I've just seen some comments come up as well. So I know you're moderating the questions, but I know Jennifer Taylor remembers the butchers in Almacut, is that I think? And the
slaughtering kosher
chickens. Yes.
Amazing,
so
amazing.
Within the community, I think there are people who will remember, and yeah.
That's incredible. That's
some of those questions.
That's wonderful. So another question, I found it so interesting, from Julia, I found it so interesting that all your ancestors were so keen to assimilate that they refused to speak their native languages. This is also true of my parents and more arriving in Canada. It was your common faith that held you together as a community, not language. Not perhaps so true of some migrants arriving here today. Were any of you brought up bilingually?
I have hardly any Yiddish words at all, just a few leftover ones, kind of legacy words.
Yes.
But
I think my parents would only have spoken German if they didn't want my sister and I me to understand what they were saying.
That's why you studied German.
Yes, so I was at no advantage at all. I think if you look at when it was, I was born in 1958, it was fairly soon after the war, and I think there was probably still prejudice against German speakers.
My grandparents, who were also Jews who spoke German and came to the UK, also didn't teach their children German either, and also used it as a way to talk privately between them as well. So I think it's a very common experience. Another question here from Deborah. Can Helen tell us about the sunflowers nursery pictured?
Oh yes, so one of the pictures there was that at Sam's we had a multi-faith parent and toddler group that ran every Monday for I think 7 years in the hall there. So it was like a community project where people could stay with their children, but it was run by a wonderful play leader, Hannah Morris, and we had really nice refreshments and toys for the children. And sadly, because of COVID, it hasn't been running for over a year now, I think. So it's a pity. But it was people liked it, I think.
That's wonderful. I really hope it can restart soon as we start to come out of this, we hope. I think we've just got one last question to answer. From Lisa, thank you all for sharing. As an American Jew living in St Albans for 11 years, it's encouraging to hear these stories of positive experiences, living out loud your heritage. What is the best way for someone to stay informed about community events?
Look on the website.
Look on our website, yes.
And the United Synagogue as well. Yes. It will have events too. So yeah.
Wonderful. It's great that there's such diverse and active Jewish communities in St Albans. So that's lovely to hear. We've had some lots of really fascinating observations from people in the chat about their personal stories of families coming from all over the world. We've got people talking about coming as a French refugee and never speaking to their children in French, and all of these interesting things coming on, like you said, about the butchers and all of this. So it's wonderful that even the participants are all sharing their stories as well. So it's lovely to hear that all of these stories around here. Yeah. I think we're going to draw this to a close because we've had some wonderful questions and we're coming towards the end of our discussion. I do want to also just say that a couple of people have wished your father Darren a speedy recovery, and just want to
thank you
to say that on behalf of everyone. We're going to come towards the end. I'm going to ask the Lord Lieutenant if he'd like to say a few words to just before we close. Lord Lieutenant, are you there?
I am indeed, but I can't get the video to start. So
oh gosh, let me see if I can help you with that.
I think you have to do that for me.
Oh. Is that coming up for you?
Right, that's it. Right.
Perfect.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolutely fascinating evening. A lot of it rings very true, obviously, to my own ears. Sylvia, I've had the great pleasure of meeting and listening to your mother, a wonderful woman. Of course, I also have the great honour of meeting a number of the Holocaust survivors and teachers in the county when I present them with their British Empire medals. So we have some wonderful people here. St Albans, of course, has quite a history as far as the lieutenancy is concerned. My predecessor was is the Countess of Verulam. And like, I can't remember who said it, but I also came to St Albans with my school, my Church of England school, as a primary school pupil, and never dreamt that I would actually have the only padded seat in the cathedral to myself many years later. So it's amazing how things turn around. If any of you want to know about the translation of the Hebrew in the cathedral, the person to ask is the bishop, because Bishop Allen actually did his thesis on the Hebrew prophets. And amusingly, when I tell my own rabbi that I spend more time in St Albans Cathedral than I do in his synagogue, he does get a little bit jealous. But it really has been a fascinating evening. Thank you so much. I agree with every comment, particularly about the diversity that is demonstrated in St Albans. St Albans is such a wonderful, wonderful city. And it really does demonstrate the diversity, and the stories that you have very generously shared with us all this evening have just demonstrated how lucky we all are that our parents, grandparents and ancestors decided to come to this country. And I thank God every day that my parents eventually got here to Britain. So thank you very much for a fascinating evening. And I personally can't wait to get to the museum to have a look at the exhibition in person.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lord Lieutenant. And that's actually a perfect way for me to mention about some of our upcoming things. Sorry for me just to run very quickly through this, but we've got all sorts of things coming up for you to get involved with, both online and in person. So we've got next month, we have another one of our online talks about our online exhibition about Handley Page, which is about some local history. It's very fascinating. We've also got an online workshop coming up for adults where you get to have an opportunity to make a mosaic in the style of the Roman mosaics at Verulamium. But when we open in May, we have 3 brand new exhibitions starting up. Pandemic Portraits, which has photos made by a local artist that tells the story of this time. We also have Lockdown Life, which brings together lots of different community groups, again, talking about the experience that people have had over this year. And also an exhibition Behind the Mask, which is about Trestle Theatre, which is a local theatre company following their history, as it's their 40th anniversary this year. So lots and lots of things for you to get involved with. So please do come and visit us in May once we're able to be open, if everything goes to plan. And I also would just like to say again, as Helen said, the exhibition that this event is all about is going to be opening, unfortunately later than we planned, but still with lots of excitement, next year on the 4th of February. So get the date in your diary for 2022, you'll be ready to come along. Again, I'd just like to say thank you so much to the panelists and for everyone who's come along this evening. It's been really fascinating. And after this, you're going to be asked to just fill in a little survey just to let us know about your experience tonight. For our funders, it's really helpful to know that. So please do fill that in, and please do come along to our future events. And thank you so much for coming. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.